Here this gets, the second part gets into the ear. So we're going to shift from the eyes and vision into the ears and hearing. The ear is going to be also involved in balance and proprioception. So this is what helps to tell us where we are in space. This is why you can close your eyes and move around, make certain decisions about where you are, turn your head to appreciate stimuli if you hear voices in different directions. All of that is a part of your equilibrium system. So your balance and proprioception and your coordination. Now we can divide the ear into three general parts: the external ear, everything outside of the ear itself, everything that you can see when you look at someone's ear, which kind of includes the external auditory canal, right? Then the middle ear is everything beyond the eardrum, also called the tympanic membrane. This smaller confined space here is called the middle ear. And then the inner ear, which is what's inside the skull itself, the bony part of the ear, which is where we have the cochlea and the rest of the semicircular canals, right? So these are going to be the inner ear structures that are connected to the nerve, the cranial nerve 8 and 7, which are hearing and balance, and that will be projected to the parts of the brain, really the temporal lobe that help with hearing. So these are the parts. This is how we can divide the ear into these three regions. And we'll look at the different components. Now, the external ear has the auricle or pinna. This is the outer sort of flap-like part of the ear, fleshy part of the ear that's attached to the head. This is extremely important in sort of trapping vibrations, trapping sound, and sending them into the tunnel, which is the external auditory canal, right? Kind of this passageway that leads to the middle ear. Important features of the external ear are cerumen or ear wax. This is a part of our production from some of the glands that are in the ear that help to clean the ear, and that is usually produced in the outer third of the auditory canal, and then that can sort of be, dispersed and help to remove any dust, debris that can get inside the ear canal itself. And then another feature of the external ear is the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane or eardrum is the border between the external ear, all of this, and the middle ear, which is behind it. This is also where those vibrations get picked up, trapped, and then amplified as they're passed on to the middle ear structures. So that's the external ear, main function, trapping those vibration sound waves and sending them towards the middle ear, as well as cleaning. As we can see here, the sebaceous glands of the outer third of the ear are what produce the cerumen or ear wax that can trap debris and send it back out. And this is why you should not really clean your ears by inserting anything too far inside, right? Because you're actually pushing that wax deeper into areas where it's not even produced or it's not even found, right? That can sort of impact against the eardrum, and that can cause further issues such as infections, hearing loss, you name it. So you really should just be cleaning the outer parts of your ear, and then normally your ear is kind of self-cleaning in that those trapped particles will move outward as opposed to in. Okay, I know we don't like to hear that. I know it kind of is satisfying to clean your ear with the Q-tips, but they really are to clean the outside of your ear. Let's look at the middle ear. The middle ear is where we pass the tympanic membrane. So from the tympanic membrane to the bony part of the ear is a smaller confined space called the middle ear. The main occupants or the main structures in the middle ear are the ossicles. And so this is where that vibration gets amplified. It hits against the tympanic membrane or eardrum. And then because the eardrum is touching these three bones, it's touching the incus or the malleus, excuse me, the first one, the incus, and then the stapes. And it's going to pass the vibration on from the outer ear, where it's touching the eardrum, to the middle ear, where it's touching the bone, right, by the oval window. So the passage of that vibration is how sound can be amplified, and then it can be processed on the the relevant nerves. Now, looking more closely at the shape of these middle ear bones, we have the malleus, which is shaped like a hammer, the incus, which is shaped like an anvil, and then the stapes, which is shaped like a stirrup, right? Kind of the strap you put your foot in, or the stirrup. So these are sort of named according to their shape, but you should know how to identify them just by looking at the shape. If I showed you just the malleus, for example, which is the first one here, you should know that this is the malleus or the hammer. You should know that the incus or the anvil is the bigger of the three, and then the stapes or stirrup, again, by their shape and their size and their location, right? Which one from first, second, third. Now, we want to also think about another feature of the middle ear, the pharyngotympanic tube or the auditory tube. This is what connects the middle ear to the nasopharynx. So if we look at the pharyngotympanic tube, it's going to be partially connected to the bony part of the ear and then partially connected to the nasopharynx, really the throat or the posterior pharynx. So this is how we can normalize the pressure that's in the ears. This is how you can pop your ears by kind of swallowing, which can equalize or redistribute that pressure, and kind of pop your ears, especially if you've had a flight or anything of that nature, or if you've had allergies or a cold, that can help to clear any mucus that's blocked, and redistribute the pressure in that cavity. So that is the pharyngotympanic tube, also called the auditory tube, and it goes straight from the middle ear, right? You can see the tympanic cavity, or tympanic membrane rather, excuse me, the stapes, anvil, hammer there, all the inner ear bone, middle ear bones, and then the tube itself going towards the nasopharynx. I also want to point out the difference in the shape of the pharyngotympanic tube in children. It's much shorter, it's much more horizontal, and it's much harder to drain. This is why kids get inner ear or just ear infections, middle ear infections, much more common. They also get much more agitated when they are in flight. It's much harder for them to redistribute the pressure or to pop their ears just organically. So because of this horizontal shape, shorter length, in the adult, it's much more vertical. So it's easier to drain. It's easier for gravity to kind of, do its thing and help to equalize the pressure, and then any mucus can be cleared out because of that as well. It's also longer in the adult. Let's talk about the oval and round window. This is where the bones connect from the middle ear towards the inner ear. So this is one of the inner ear structures called the bony labyrinth, right? Or the inner ear labyrinth. And so the round window and the oval window, this is how we can get that sound transferred from the middle ear towards the inner ear. We can add that meaning as it's transferred onto the relevant cranial nerves. So the oval window is going to be the area where we have these stapes connecting. So the foot plate of the stapes, if you look at the shape of the stapes, I'm going to go back here for a second. The stapes has this foot plate, and the base of it is what is pressed up against the oval window. So here's the stapes, which is the third bone, pressed up against the bony part of the ear, and then that is the connection to the oval window, which leads to the labyrinth. So that means that when sound comes in, it's amplified against the tympanic membrane, it moves across the bones, and then because it's touching the bony labyrinth, that vibration can then be passed on to the inner ear bones, to the bony labyrinth, and then that can pass to the cochlea, which is where we can perceive sound, and then it's transferred as sensory stimuli onto the cranial nerve. Right. Now, there are two parts to the bony labyrinth. One is the cochlea. The cochlea is involved in hearing. The other is the vestibular apparatus. And the vestibular apparatus contains the semicircular canals as well as the utricle and saccule. So these parts of the labyrinth or the inner ear are involved in equilibrium, in balance, whereas the cochlea itself is involved in hearing. Together, both of these structures are known as the inner ear or the bony labyrinth or the labyrinth. If we look more closely at the internal anatomy of the cochlea, we're going to find three different spaces. Okay, so here's the cochlea. If we kind of cut into it, we can see these three smaller spaces that are repeated. And if we look more closely at these three spaces, they're differently named. So the scala vestibuli on top, the cochlear duct, and then the scala tympani. Now, these are separated by two membranes. The superior is called the vestibular membrane, and the inferior is called the basilar membrane. And this is why I say it's so nice to add the function to these structures, because it'll help you actually remember and differentiate the structures. Now, the cochlear duct is where hearing is most intimately, sort of processed. So the cochlear duct or the middle space is where hearing is perceived. So those vibrations touch the cochlea. The vibrations come in and they're passed on to the hair cells that are found along the basilar membrane. And then this is how the hair cells will pick up the vibration as they're moving back and forth, and then send that towards the nerve. And then that is how we can perceive those vibrations as some kind of meaningful sound. Okay, you perceive them as they travel on the nerve to the various parts of the brain that will interpret them into sound. This region is sometimes called a spiral organ, right? It's sandwiched in between the other two parts, the basilar membrane as well as the tectorial membrane. So here's a tectorial membrane. Here is the basilar membrane. And then this is where we have the spiral organ that is found within the cochlear duct. So that spiral organ has these hair cells, these ciliated receptor cells that will detect sound waves that are coming in and then transfer them as sensory impulses onto the cranial nerve. And then that is how we perceive. Now shifting to the other part of the labyrinth, this is the vestibular apparatus. It has several smaller parts that have their own different function, all involved in equilibrium and balance. So the semicircular canals are one part of the vestibular apparatus. And these are the three sort of loop-like structures that are found on top of the cochlea. These are controlled by the utricle and saccule. Here's the utricle, also connected to the cranial nerve and the saccule. And these are oriented in three different planes. So the semicircular canals, there's one in a sagittal plane, there's one in a coronal plane, and then one in a transverse plane. So they're kind of all in three different planes, and these are involved in determining our position of head movements. So when you move your head from side to side, one of these canals will send signals. When you move your head back and forth, and when you move your head sort of in that frontal plane. So side to side, back and forth, etc., will trigger different parts of the semicircular canal to send signals depending on where you're moving your head. Another thing to point out here is it also determines angular acceleration. So basically moving your head quickly or slowly in certain directions as well can be picked up and perceived by way of those projections towards the cranial nerve. Lastly, let's talk about the nose. And the nose is the region that perceives olfaction or smell, and it's by way of the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1. Structures involved in the nose would be the septum. The septum is partially bone, partially mucous membrane covering that bone, and this separates the nostrils or both sides of the nasal cavity. That projects towards the choana. The choana are the openings that lead towards the nasopharynx. So both of the nasal cavities are going to become a shared space by way of the posterior choana. And if you look more closely at the nose or the nasal cavity without the mucous membrane, without the septum, we can appreciate the concha. The concha are these bulges in the lateral surface of the nasal cavity that are these wind turbinates, right? These act to increase the resonance of the head. They're kind of these dilated spaces in the nasal cavity. The superior concha and middle concha are parts of the ethmoid bone, and then the inferior concha is a part of, is a separate bone on its own. It's a separate bone by itself. So these three are intimately connected that form the lateral wall of the nasal cavity and are then covered by the mucous membrane that makes up the septum. We also want to think about the sinuses. The sinuses are these hollow air-filled cavities in the skull. These also help to act similarly as the concha. They help to lighten the head, provide resonance for the voice. And these are air-filled, so there's nothing in them normally, but they can become fluid-filled. This is where we can have sinusitis or even infection or fluid or mucus occupying these spaces. And then that can lead to that heaviness in the head that we feel whenever we have a cold or infection or sinusitis, etc. Okay. Now the location of these are pretty self-explanatory. The frontal sinus is in the frontal bone, and they're paired really in between the brows, kind of the glabella, that smooth region of the forehead. Beneath the bone is where we have the frontal sinus. The sphenoid sinus is in between the sphenoid bone. Ethmoid sinus is going to be more anterior, right? So sphenoid sinus is deeper between the sphenoid bone. Ethmoid is more anterior. And the ethmoid sinuses are smaller, so they're usually referred to as being air cells. Instead of a larger cavity or sinus, there are these tiny openings in the ethmoid bone called air cells, kind of like the holes in a sponge, if you will. And then lastly, the maxillary sinus is the largest of the four. They are paired, found in the maxillary region or the cheekbone region, and these are usually most commonly involved in sinusitis, in infection, etc., right? Giving that pressure around the eyes, pressure around the nose whenever we have these infections. And then we want to introduce two muscles of mastication as we're speaking about the head, the jaw, the face, and some of the related structures, the temporalis and the masseter. These are two of our muscles of mastication that help with the movement of the jaw, the temporomandibular joint, that help us to chew, and even certain aspects of speaking, swallowing, etc. So the temporalis is the large muscle in the temporal region. And then the masseter is also going to be found laterally, but more so along the zygomatic and the mandibular bones, right? Connected from the zygomatic to the mandibular and the jaw region. So when we think about the location of these muscles, they help to open and close the jaw, which is really important in chewing. Okay. Other muscles of mastication would be the buccinator or buccinator, sometimes called. And the buccinator is the muscle deep here in the cheek. So here's the masseter that we just looked at. And then here's the deeper buccinator. And the buccinator helps to puff the cheeks out. If you look at its position, it helps to maintain air in the oral cavity, which can be important in actions like blowing, right? If you're trying to blow a candle out or certain aspects of, drinking from a straw and that sort of thing. Those types of actions where we need to maintain air in the oral cavity, especially in phonetics of certain words, that would be helped by the buccinator. And then we have two orbicular muscles. Orbicular means that these are rounded, sphincter-like muscles. Orbicularis oris around the mouth. This helps with certain actions, of kissing, eating, chewing, certain phonetics in speaking, sounding out certain words. And then orbicularis oculi is around the eye. That is important